Hello, everybody, and welcome to I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. And Gavin, it is not just the two of us again.
Hello!
It's not.
Fia's
we have
back.
Our wonderful best good friend, Fia.
Guess who's back? Back again.
We're one whole unit again,
Yeah.
and it makes me happy.
Yeah, me too.
Absolutely. No, we missed Fia doing her outdoing her field work. Sadly, she's going to be back out doing it next week as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
But
Busy times.
we'll cross those bridges when we come to it. You know, science must go on.
That is true.
but while Fia was out, I mean, big time shout out to Dr. Bob last week. That was a fun episode about the Adirondacks.
Absolutely.
If you haven't had a chance to go listen to it, I mean, there's no Fia, so you know that kind of sucks. But like, it was a fun episode talking about the Adirondack Mountains with somebody that actually knows what they're talking about.
You know, as someone who was a former number one fan of the pod, I don't listen to the pod anymore because I'm on it.
Right.
But when I'm away, I feel like this gives me a good opportunity to go back and listen to it.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what.
So,
I mean,
before-
I'm sure you guys
Oh,
noticed
go
this. I didn't listen to a single episode of the pod when I was gone this summer on hiking the Adirondack
Nice.
Mountains. I needed a break from my entire old life, and this was part of it. So, Fia, you are a step ahead of me, certainly.
At least you're candid.
I'm never going to lie to you guys.
That's true. All right. Well, before we get into the actual meat and potatoes of this week's episode, Fia, do you have some special messages for us?
Don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Give us feedback about the show and any future topics you would like to hear on the podcast. If you want to be a guest on the show, please fill out our guest form, which can be all found in the show notes.
So, normally at this point, we announce next week's episode topic, but it's an episode that ends in 5, which means
Oh, wait. Oh, boy.
that is a Mike Takes the Wheel episode.
It's been a little bit. All right.
It sure has.
So part of the reason why we're not announcing the topic for next week's episode is because you know damn well I don't have a topic for next week's episode yet.
I sure do, buddy. And that's okay.
That's okay.
But
Yes.
if you have any sort of history questions, or if you want to guess what Mike's going to throw at us next, if you want to look through the back catalog of Mike Takes the Wheel episodes and try and come up with any kind of pattern there,
Good luck. You'd be a better
be
person
my
than I
guest.
am.
But yeah, so if you're looking forward to that, let us know in the various ways to get in contact with the podcast. But now into some of the actual content of the episode. We move over to Swamp Corner. And what do you have for us this week, Fia?
So, I very last minute put this one together, but it happened to be on topic of our podcast episode. Spoilers, it's snakes. The Swamp Corner organism that I have for you guys today is the Speckled Worm Eel, Myrophis punctatus. It's in the snake eel family. I'm not going to even try to pronounce what it actually is.
Ophicthidae.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Ophicthidae, which is meaning, I guess, snake eel family, or what colloquially people call that. But yeah, they're found in the Atlantic Ocean, Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, and then a little more south towards Brazil. They're benthic organisms, so they live on the bottom floor of the ocean, and they are preyed upon by bony fish. They're found often with structures, so things like seagrass, mangroves, offshore reefs, as well as oyster reefs, because I also find them in my oyster reefs.
Cool.
And they can be anywhere to full salinity to brackish waters. And finally, they like to eat amphipods and microphytobenthos, which I had to look up what that was. And it's basically photosynthetic microorganisms like diatom, cyanobacteria, green algae. And then annelids, they also eat, which are worms. And yeah, they're a pretty cool looking guy. Take a look on Google if you care to learn about the speckled worm eel.
I'm nervous because the first thing that came to my mind was when you said annelids, which are a worm. They are one of like an infinite number of types of worms.
Yeah,
and then I was
very
like, we should do
small.
an episode on worms. And then I was like, no,
Ooh. Why not?
absolutely not.
Oh.
Because worm has such a loaded context. Most people
That's true.
think of as a worm is an annelid, but there's like 1,000 not even vaguely closely related groups of worms.
Yeah.
And I don't want to touch that. Literally or figuratively, to be honest.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you for that Swamp Corner, Fia. And that takes us to Today in History. What do you got for us, Mike?
Okay, so today in history, going to keep it real short here. It's been a lot of stuff in the news recently about a particular baseball player. I know neither of you guys are big baseball fans, but anything that has like permeated your non-baseball existence? Has anything been happening in the baseball world that you guys are aware of?
Aaron Judge.
Good, Fia. Well done. So there's been lots of hate.
That was pure guess.
Well, I mean, that's the one big baseball story recently. So well done, Fia.
Also, coincidentally, there was a CNN piece that they just recently did with A-Rod. So I thought it was going to be something about him.
Nothing A-Rod related. So Aaron Judge has been making a lot of headlines recently for hitting, at the time of recording, 61 home runs and quite likely soon 62, which will break Roger Maris's old record for most home runs in a season. The problem is that that's not the record for most home runs in a season. And despite what a lot of people will say, just because other guys use steroids does not mean they did not play the game. So today in history, October 5th, 2001, Barry Bonds hit his 71st and 72nd home runs to take over the individual single-season home run record holder. He would hit one more home run in that season for 73 total. So just to put this out there, Aaron Judge having an incredible season, one of the best offensive seasons of all time. He's not the single-season record holder, and he will not be. That is Barry Bonds, and he did that in 2001. So
you heard it here first, folks. Mike is defending steroids.
Absolutely, 100%. 100%. So I'm also defending just like math in general, like, counting and greater than and less than symbols. So, I don't think I'm going out on too strong of a limb here, but also steroids. So, yeah.
Is that really like a debated thing that people are just like, no, that just does not exist because they did steroids? Who's to say?
Yeah, the people who have been confirmed to have done steroids, they'll have like an asterisk next to pretty much all of their records. So it's like they technically still have the record.
Yeah.
Right.
And also,
they technically still have the record, but it's complicated.
Just to be clear about this, too, when it comes to confirmed to have done steroids, a lot of these guys that we're talking about in the single-season home run record chase, we're talking about Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, and Sammy Sosa. Mark McGwire, years after the fact, did admit he did steroids, but Barry Bonds and Sammy Sosa, while it is widely suspected that they did steroids, have never failed a drug test and never admitted to have done steroids. So
yet.
Right. And that kind of goes with the whole thing of, again, you never know who is doing what. So that is my little soapbox plea here, that math exists, the records exist, and Barry Bonds is the single-season record holder. He did so on this day in 2001.
Also, quick question.
Yeah.
That does not include the postseason, right?
Correct. So the regular season home run chase is just, or the single season home run records, and pretty much every single season record is just regular season, not the postseason.
Okay. That was just for my own knowledge. But
no, it's a great question. A lot of people are unsure of that kind of a thing. So yeah, that was Today in History, and now we are going to turn it over to Gavin for the actual meat of today's episode. Gavin, start talking.
Yeah, so first and foremost, I'd like to apologize to my wife because she's going to hate this episode. She is very afraid of snakes to the point where if I talk about them too much, she gets very emotional. And I also apologize for having just outed her on the podcast. But
it's okay, Liz.
Snakes. Snakes are very cool animals. So we're going to talk about what are snakes, which, like with a good handful of episode topics that we've done, like the elephants and rhinos and stuff like that, it seems kind of weird to be being like, what is a snake? But that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about what snakes are related to, because it might not be necessarily what you think. And how did they get to be so weird? So,
yes.
First of all, snakes are incredibly diverse. They have around 30 families, 520 genera, the plural of genus, with around 3,900 species, which is only like 10 to 15% less than the number of mammals. So this is just snakes.
Mm-hmm.
Snakes are very diverse. And they are also incredibly widespread. They live on every continent except Antarctica. And for reptiles, they are able to live in much higher altitudes and latitudes than most other reptiles. Like crocodilians are not cold tolerant at all. Like the most cold tolerant crocodilian is the American alligator. And that only gets as far north as like North Carolina and like southern North Carolina. Turtles, kind of okay at it. Some, very specialized species of lizards are kind of okay at it. But snakes really are about as cold tolerant as non-bird reptiles get. For example, they live all through even like Scandinavia, way up in like Finland, Sweden, all the way to the very northern parts of Scandinavia. Yeah.
How do they survive the winter?
They go into, it's effectively the reptile version of hibernation. It's called brumation.
Oh,
very similar, but metabolically different than what mammals do. Mm-hmm. They live well north of the Great Lakes here in North America, and as far south as just barely missing out on the southern tip of South America.
So not just the tip?
No.
Okay.
And they live in all types of environments. They from places like the Amazon all the way to the entire Himalayas, pretty much, except for some of like the highest peaks, even like the Sahara Desert. Snakes live effectively everywhere, except for very famously a handful of places that I'd like to point out because I think it's fun. Antarctica, like I mentioned, but specifically the island of Ireland.
Oh, that's nice.
There are no native snakes to Ireland, and there's actually a legend about St. Patrick, of the famous St. Patrick's Day. I believe that holiday celebrates St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland. I'm pretty sure that's supposedly the origin of why we celebrate that holiday.
Huh. So when you said there's no snakes native to Ireland, are there no snakes at all on the island, or has some snakes been introduced?
I'm positive that there are snakes there now, because snakes make very good invasive species because they are so adaptable and can live in a lot of places. Mm-hmm. So pretty much everywhere except Antarctica that there were not native snakes, there probably are now. Like, for example, New Zealand originally had no native snakes. I'm positive there are some now.
Really? Okay.
Places like Iceland, I don't know for a fact that there are none on Iceland, or that there are some on Iceland today. But it would not surprise me if there were like an invasive species of snake or two. Mm-hmm. All the continents except Antarctica, and then a handful of islands that now probably also have snakes on them because humans like to bring lots of unwanted guests.
Yeah, we do that.
Yeah. Snakes also come in a very wide variety of sizes, all the way from the Barbados thread snake, which tops out at about 4 inches long, to the extremely large snakes that people tend to be more afraid of, such as reticulated pythons, Burmese pythons, green anacondas, which get somewhere in the ballpark between 20 and 25 feet long and a good few hundred pounds. However, that being said, those are the ones that are more famous. The vast majority of snakes don't get more than about 3 feet long. The average snake is pretty much like a garter snake, more or less.
Is the standard deviation on snake distribution like pretty small? Like most of them kind of fall in that narrow band of 2-3 feet.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's comforting.
Yeah. And this shape is extremely flexible, as in the shape of being a tube. And I mean flexible in many ways. It's very adaptable. So there are snakes that do just about everything. The snake body is really good at climbing. It's really good at swimming. It's really good at moving really quietly through grass and things. There's even a species of gliding snake, which is awesome. If you've never seen a video of it, look it up. It's incredible.
Wow.
Yeah, they just launch themselves from trees, and they like
Whoa.
spread out their ribs and basically slither through the air, but their entire body is like a long frisbee, and they glide through the air and just slither through the air, and it looks like they're flying. And they can go like a good, I think I heard at some point like well over 50 meters, even probably up to like 100 meters if they were at a high enough tree.
Wow.
That's going to be a sight to see. I mean, I wouldn't want to see it personally, but like, you
Right.
know, on video maybe.
Yeah. So this is an extremely and literally and figuratively flexible body shape.
Cool.
And while we're going to talk about some snake features here first and then talk about what they're related to, I'm going to say this up front because it helps talk about some of their features, is that snakes are lizards. We'll talk more about that, but unlike a lot of the things like dinosaurs, where the root word saur or sauria means lizard, almost nothing that you have heard of, that you know the scientific name of, that has saur in it is actually a lizard or even closely related. So like dinosaurs, not closely related.
Right.
Ichthyosaurs, not closely related. Pterosaurs, not closely related. Lizards are true and proper snakes are true and proper lizards. Just as much as a gecko, as much as an iguana, as much as a bearded dragon or a monitor lizard, just as much of a lizard as those things.
Okay. I can get behind that.
Okay.
Like I said, I say that because it helps to talk about some of their features. So, the most notable feature of snakes is that they don't have any legs. They're just kind of a noodle with a head. With a small caveat in that some actually have vestigial hind legs. Some of the more quote-unquote primitive groups like the boas and the pythons have these two little, they're called spurs, down by their cloaca, which is basically just a remnant claw from when they used to have legs. We're not really sure why they still have it. It's kind of thought that it might help in their mating somehow. Not sure. But if you know what to look for, they still have legs. Like all other lizards, one of the defining characteristics of lizards is that they have overlapping scales. So this is extremely obvious in snakes, and very unlike things like crocodilians or turtles that have scutes. They basically have little blocks that sort of just fit together of scales. If you look at like a turtle shell, the little their version of scales don't overlap at all. They just sort of meet at the seams. Because snakes are so specialized into this long tube shape, their organs are all kind of funky. For example, all of their organs that are normally paired and side by side instead have to be one in front of the other. So that's the case of their kidneys, their reproductive organs, but not the case of their lungs because they only usually have one.
What?
Yep. The other one's usually there, but it doesn't do anything.
Okay.
Wait, hold on. Back up. So there's two lungs, but only one of them works?
Well, the other one is vestigial and very, very small.
Okay.
Okay.
Theoretical question.
Yeah.
Somehow they puncture their main lung. Can they use their vestigial lung? Oh, okay. So it's really pointless. It's not even an extra.
Yes. Yeah, it's like less than 5% the size. And I'm just based on like some diagrams I've seen. And I have dissected a couple snakes, but
really? That's fun.
Yeah, just based on my memory and some diagrams I looked at for, the research for this episode, yeah, it's like easily less than 5% the size of the main lung.
Dang.
Yeah, so it's not even like an emergency backup lung.
Yeah.
So all of their organs get mushed around into this funky shape. And they actually have some really cool things going on with their genetics in order to, make that happen, but also with the limb loss. We don't have time to go into that today because this episode was already really long. It took up like 4 pages of notes, and I didn't want to add up some genetic stuff that only I'm going to care about. So if you are interested in some of the genetic stuff of how snakes lost their limbs, it's really interesting.
Cool.
However, snakes are not the only group of lizards that have lost their legs. In fact, not even close. Without looking at the doc, Any guesses as to how many times lizards have independently lost their legs?
Like throughout all time?
That we're aware of. And I think this
Okay.
might even just be based on currently living groups of lizards.
Like 15, maybe?
I don't think so. Here's the thing. I'm assuming the number is like either 1 or 2 or like, several thousand. I'm assuming it's not like
1,000?
right, like I'm assuming the answer is not like, oh no, we have independently counted 15 but not 16 times. I'm assuming the answer is like 2 or, like, a lot more than that. I'm going to go with 3.
No. Fia was closer. It is give or take 25 times.
Really?
Wow.
And we've been
Yep.
able to count those individually each time?
Yeah.
When I say we, I'm of course including myself in this as part of the team that was counting.
The royal we.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's
Wow.
So we just have, where it's like this 1 or 2 groups of skinks independently just lost their legs. This gecko over here lost its legs. This is just something that lizards are very fond of doing. And snakes just took that and ran with it. Because that's not to say the other ones don't do well. They are perfectly well adapted to their environments. Most of them seem to be doing pretty okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like snakes are like out competing them or anything, but snakes seem to have done it very early relative to some of the other ones, as well as metaphorically, because evolution doesn't really have a goal, but really just like took the no legs thing and just really ran with it. Metaphorically, because they can't run.
Well done.
Thank you. Aside from the leglessness thing, which like I said, that by itself is not a defining characteristic of this is a snake, this is not a snake. Snakes also have some other features. Mostly that they lack external ears. If you look at the head of a snake, they don't have ear holes.
Oh, really?
Which is weird. Yeah. Pretty much all the other legless lizards do.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking of like a bearded dragon, how they have like those little holes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I guess snakes don't.
Nope. Snakes have an eyelid cap, which most people might think of like a gecko when they lick their eyes. So they have a scale that grows over their eye to like encapsulate their eye. So it's like their eye is permanently closed, but their eyelid is see-through. So that's why when they shed their skin, they have an eye on it. They don't have just a hole where their eye is.
I'm confused.
Go ahead. What do you got?
So they have 2 eyelids or just one?
Nope.
And it's
Just one.
but it's always closed.
It's always closed.
Okay.
Why?
But it's see-through. We'll get into that a little bit.
Okay.
When we talk about their evolution, because that is, like I said, they're not the only group of lizards that do that. Lots of geckos do that, as well as I'm sure lots of other lizards. Why snakes specifically did it, we'll get there when we talk about their evolution. But that by itself is not an unusual thing for lizards to do. But the most defining thing about snakes is their skulls, because their skulls are crazy. Lizards in general have very mobile skulls. Their bones are not particularly well fused to one another. Snakes really took that and ran with it. And the main thing is that all snakes are predators. Even things like spiders, there's like a species or 2 that somehow eat plants. That's not a thing in snakes. All snakes have to eat other animals. Because of this, they've become very ingenious about the different ways that they can open their mouth. And all of their bones being not well fused together, and allows them to move their face in various ways because they don't have arms to be able to manipulate their food. So, because of this, they have a large amount of it's called Cranial Kinesis. They can just move the bones in their skull around in really strange ways. The most famous example is in their lower jaws. So, unlike you, so your lower jaw is 2 bones, one on either side of your head that sort of fuse where your chin is.
Yeah.
Snakes don't have that. Snakes have a ligament that connects them instead of like an actual chin, and they can separate it out and open their mouth sort of wider to the side. They also have their jaw attached to their skull very far back, which lets, just gives them a wider angle that they can open it at. And then they also more or less have a second joint at that hinge that allows it to open even wider. They can also move each side of the jaw independently, which lets them sort of hook in and then walk their prey back into their face because they don't have arms to do that for them.
That is a depiction I did not want to have in my brain.
Yeah, if you've never watched a snake eat something, like, it might be a little disturbing, but definitely look it up. It's very interesting. And also their upper jaws aren't all that well fused to the rest of their skull, so they can also be moved a little bit as well. That's an excellent question. They are just not fused.
Okay,
which
that's just so foreign a concept to me as somebody who's, as somebody whose
jaw is fused.
Upper jaw is fused. But okay.
Yeah. They can't move it nearly as much as they can the lower jaw, but they can sort of wiggle it a little bit. They can't like use that as much to walk in their food like they can the lower jaw, but they can sort of nudge it in with their top jaw.
Okay.
So those are the features that sort of make snakes snakes. I could go on and list all the weird, unique things about snakes all day, but we don't have time for that. Snakes are really cool. Let's talk a little bit about the snake diversity, because most people, I would wager, if you are afraid of snakes, you picture big snakes when you think of snakes. If you're not afraid of snakes, you probably think of your favorite snake, which in my case is the hognose snake, because they're really cool and have these little tiny upturned noses that they use to like shovel through dirt. They're very cute.
Nice.
But there are pretty much three main groups that people will be vaguely familiar with. The pythons, the boas, and then a group that is very big and very broad that we'll talk a little bit more about and break down, which is called the Collubroids. And like I said, we'll talk about that in a minute. Pythons and boas are only superficially similar. They're not very closely related at all, but they're often lumped together because they tend to be bigger, and they're the famous constricting snakes, even though most snakes constrict their prey. But yeah, they're, like I said, often just lumped together because they tend to be some of the bigger ones. These are your anacondas, your boa constrictors, things like reticulated pythons as well in the python group. But there are lots of anatomical differences as well, but pythons are exclusive to the Old World and Australia, so you will not find native pythons anywhere in the Americas. While boas live everywhere, but are much more famous from here in the New World.
Why is that?
So that just happens to be where they evolved.
Okay.
Which is a little odd now I'm thinking about it, because boas in particular are a very old group. We'll talk about a particular member of their group that got real big later. But yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it just as a matter of where they happened to go. There are some things that you will sometimes hear called boas in the Old World that are sort of technically not boas. I'm sure that there are some here and there, but most of the roles that pythons fill in like Southeast Asia and all the rainforests and jungles around there are filled by boas in the New World. Okay. So there's lots of different kinds of tree pythons and tree boas that sort of do the same job, but in different places.
Okay.
That other group, the Collubroids, make up about 85% of snakes. So this is a massive group. The main family is called Collubridae, and this is pretty much all of your quote-unquote average snakes. These are your garter snakes, your water snakes, rat snakes, milk snakes, king snakes, corn snakes, etc. All your fairly normal, typically non-venomous snakes. However, this larger group, the Collubroids, also includes most of your venomous snakes, with things like your vipers and your elapids, which are your cobras and their relatives. Vipers include things like the gaboon vipers, which, despite only being about 4 or 5 feet long, have the largest fangs of any snake, because they're vipers and have those wicked long, like 4-inch teeth that
That's just nuts.
Yeah. The vipers also include things like your rattlesnakes, pit vipers, etc. Elapids include cobras, but also things like your coral snakes, most of the venomous sea snakes, things like mambas as well, and the king cobra, which isn't technically a cobra, but is in this group. So that's the types of snakes and their features. But where do snakes sort of fit on the reptile family tree? I already mentioned that snakes are lizards, which means that they are in a group called the lepidosaurs. So the large reptile family tree, on one side there's the lepidosaurs, which are where your lizards and snakes and things like the tuatara are. On the other side is your archosaurs. That's where your crocodilians, your dinosaurs and birds, potentially turtles. Turtles are weird. We don't super know where they go, but we think it's on that side. So they are on a completely separate side of the reptile family tree as things like dinosaurs. And snakes, in particular, are not like a group that split off really early in this group of reptiles. Sometimes you'll get a group that splits off really early and isn't really closely related to anything else. That's probably what happened with turtles. They split off really early and then got real weird. So that's why we don't really know where they go. But snakes, that's not the case. For example, there are lizards that are more closely related to snakes than they are to some other lizards.
Whoa. Because genetics or...
So
genetics?
Yes, technically, but most of the time when you say that, it means like their most recent common ancestor.
Okay.
So for example, essentially all lizards are more closely related to snakes than they are to geckos or skinks. So for example, chameleons, monitor lizards, bearded dragons, iguanas, tegus, all of those are more closely related to snakes than they are to geckos or skinks. Geckos and skinks split off pretty early in the lizard timeline. And so all of those have more in common and have a more recent common ancestor with snakes than they do with other things that people would call lizards as well. Which is a little weird to wrap your head around because snakes look so different.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not too uncommon, though, things being related to each other despite not looking like each other, right?
Right. I mean, humans look very strange compared to our relatives.
Right.
And the reason that we know this isn't actually really from fossils. We'll get up to the fossils in a little bit. Spoilers, there's not many. But the reason we know this is because of genetics. And it's not often that I give genetics too much credit on this podcast. But this is a case where it actually is very helpful because they didn't try to just go by percent similarity, which is sometimes where I think genetics really goes wrong. Where it's like, oh, these things have X percent of their genetics in common. They must be more related than this other thing that has less of a percent in common, which you would think works, but because of the way evolution works, evolution is very complicated. So just going by percent difference or similarity in DNA doesn't always tell you which groups are more related to each other when they've been separated for tens to hundreds of millions of years,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
In the early 2000s, so like fairly recently in terms of science, some researchers decided to take a sort of harder look into the genetics of venom in snakes. One of the things that snakes are pretty much the most famous for. Some, you might argue some things like spiders or scorpions or things like that are more famous for their venom, but I would consider snakes to be some of the most famous venomous, really dangerous animals out there in the world. And what they ended up finding was that lots of quote-unquote non-venomous snakes actually did produce some form of venom. It just wasn't in concentrated amounts like it is in vipers or cobras. But, so it's not meaningful to humans really, but it's meaningful to their prey, which is really all you need venom to do.
Right.
So this finding was very surprising to a lot of people. And this got people looking at the actual genetics of, how venom happens, how it evolves, where it's located on the genome, things like that. Some of the more complicated things that, again, we're not super going to get into. But they had kind of thought that the genetics were very specialized for venom, because venom are very specific proteins that cause all this damage when they get injected into you. And not only did they find the genes for venom in all these species of snakes that they don't consider venomous, but they found it in lots of species of lizards that are not known to be venomous. There are only a handful of venomous lizards. Things like a couple species of monitor lizards, and then a handful of species like the Gila monster or your beaded lizards here in like southern North America. But all of those, were just kind of thought to be one-off cases. But finding these venom genes in things like iguanas, agamids, which include things like your bearded dragons, an incredibly common pet lizard, or probably the second most common pet lizard, and they have the same or similar genes for venom as things like cobras do, which was fairly surprising to a lot of people. So the researchers who discovered this decided to create a new group. As you do when you discover that this group and this group are related, you need to come up with a new group that includes all of those groups. So they created a new group that contained all the lizards known to have those venom genes, including snakes, which they called Toxicophora, which I think is a wonderful name.
That's
That is
fantastic.
nice.
So in this group, we have all of those lizards on one side and a group called Pythonomorpha, which is snakes, mosasaurs, and some of their cousins on the other side. So that's the general snake family tree.
Okay.
Cool.
But how did snakes get to be these little noodles, or sometimes gigantic noodles? the forbidden pasta.
Gross. Okay, question. Have either of you ever eaten snake?
No.
No.
Me neither. Just checking.
I know. Yeah. Well, reading through a lot of these things, I did see many a picture of snake meat, which I wasn't particularly fond of. It didn't really look appetizing. Although, very fun anecdote that I'm not going to take too much time on. But I remember sometime maybe like 2 years ago seeing some news go about an early human. I don't remember if it was like Homo sapiens or whether it was a Neanderthal or some other species of human or human cousin. But I think it was found in like northern Africa somewhere. But they found in a human coprolite, which is fossilized poop, the bones, including a fang of some kind of viper.
What?
A
Yeah.
viper.
Yep. Which
That's
are
crazy.
all venomous. Yeah, so they ate most likely the skull and all the pointy teeth of a viper. And then, because it was a coprolite, they passed it. And so, moving on. It was sort of hypothesized that it might have been for some kind of religious or spiritual sort of thing.
Okay.
I'm not qualified to speak about that kind of thing, but somebody at one point ate a whole snake And I'm positive that probably wasn't the first time or the last time. So,
yeah.
Talk about their evolution now. How do we get from a relatively normal-looking lizard, a proper, tetrapod with the 4 legs that they should have, to these noodles? And a big part of that we'll probably never know, because snakes don't leave great fossils. And despite some of them being quite large, their bones are relatively small and fragile, because especially their skulls, which would probably be the most helpful thing for understanding their evolution, because their skulls are so unfused and flexible, that also means that they're very fragile. And fragile bones do not turn into good fossils.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, even in your body, the probably at least like top 3 biggest bones in a human body are your thigh bone, your upper arm bone, and your shin bone. And snakes don't have any of that. All they have to work with are skull bones and then vertebrae and ribs. That's all they got.
Right.
So, because of that, if there's one thing that snakes do have a lot of, it is vertebrae. So the vast majority of snake fossils are backbones, because they have several hundred of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even though that might not be the most ideal thing for telling one species apart from another, researchers have gotten really, really good about looking at all the very minute details of even a single snake backbone, and figuring out what it does, whether it was aquatic, whether it climbed, how big it was, potentially what it ate, even just from a single backbone or two. Because snakes are so weird, we've spent a ton of time researching them. And so, from a single backbone or two, you can tell a lot about a snake.
That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was actually very impressive how much we kind of know about snakes, given how few fossils we have and how relatively poor the fossils that we have are.
And so how do you verify that what they know is right? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It would mostly be people doing, repeat studies and coming up with the same results, or by comparing them to modern snakes that we can observe this snake and we know that it spends most of its time in trees or in the water, and we know that it mostly eats this kind of prey, and it has these features on its backbones for doing that, and then comparing it to fossils.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some times, and I don't know a specific example off the top of my head, but if we found a snake that was we don't know what this was doing, we can't even really guess if there's not a modern one to sort of compare it to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But no, that was a really good question.
Cool.
So the first squamates, so that is the lizard group, appear in the early Jurassic period, so sometime around just after 200 million years ago or so, right after a big mass extinction at the end of the Triassic period. And at this time, they basically just look like lizards, your normal garden variety lizard.
Garden lizard.
Much, much, much later, in the Cretaceous period, we start to see some of the changes that we sort of associate with the snake to lizard, or I keep saying that backwards, lizard to snake transition. And firstly, there's a little bit of controversy about why snakes would lose their limbs. Even though, like I said, lizards have done that many times. But why snakes specifically did it is kind of up for debate. And there are 2 sort of leading hypotheses. One is that they did it as an adaptation for burrowing, and the other is that they did it as an adaptation for swimming. Unfortunately, adaptations that make you good for burrowing also usually make you pretty good at swimming.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know. Pretty much.
And for a good example of that, look at moles. Moles are really good, obviously, at digging, but they're also really good swimmers. It turns out if you just turn your hands into shovels, shovels are really good at digging, but they also make pretty good oars as well.
Okay.
So, whereas with things like moles, we can tell, okay, if you were doing this specifically for swimming, you probably wouldn't take this route. This seems like the, walking around the block 3 times when you could have just walked 10 feet that direction to get to the same place. They took the long route if you were turning your hands into oars to become aquatic. But we don't have that kind of evidence for snakes because they don't have limbs to sort of give us clues like a proper animal does. And a lot of the features that I sort of talked about when talking about the different features of snakes could be good for either. Streamlined bodies would be good for pushing your way through dirt or water. Those eye caps would be really good at keeping dirt out of your eyes. Or it could be really good for preventing the loss of ions. If you were in salt water, preventing you from losing water through your eyes if you lived in the ocean. If you sealed off your eye, that wouldn't happen. Similar thing with no ears. If you don't have ear holes, you can't get dirt in your ears if you're digging underground. And if you're in the water, you can just hear by being in the water. Water transmits sound waves much more efficiently than air tends to. So
Right.
all of these things could be good for either. So they don't really lend one way or the other. So there's especially looking at some of the actually fairly decent fossils that we have from the late Cretaceous for snakes, it kind of leans more toward the marine, or at least aquatic, because a lot of their relatives from this time were aquatic, but the jury's still out.
Okay.
But going through their timeline a little bit, and like I said, this part's going to be fairly sparse because we don't have a ton of great fossils, especially for like the actual transition. However, one that you will see a lot is a genus called Najash, which is an early snake that still had hind limbs. It still had very functional back legs that were fully connected to a pelvis, and that pelvis was fully connected to the spine. And there were also lots that had a pelvis that was not connected to the spine, which, is sort of on the way to losing them. But this one was doing completely fine, and it was not alone either. There were lots of snakes with hind limbs around this time as well. And they were doing their thing, just like when we talked about tetrapods coming up onto land. There were lots of fish that looked very salamander-like that were super content with staying in the water. It's not like losing their legs was the snake's end goal. It was just something that happened.
Right.
And so around this time, like I said, this was late Cretaceous, so give or take 110 to 90-ish million years ago. And another one that might come up from around this time is called Tetrapatophys, which literally means four-limbed snake. Because it very much looks like a snake that has all four legs. However, this is a very controversial fossil. And not just for the scientists disagreeing about it thing.
Okay, who stole it from who?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Here we go.
It was very likely collected and exported illegally from Brazil to a private collector in Germany who had it on loan to a German museum. And so when it got published in 2015, the Brazilian government was like, we don't remember authorizing this thing to be sold to this guy. And also, like I said, it was in a private collection and was only on loan to the museum, which is generally a no-no for most researchers. Even at the time, I think that was a general, hey, don't do that. Because if it's in a private collection, that person gets to decide which scientists they like and which ones can do research on it, which is not the point of science. Science needs to be repeatable in order for it to be reliable. And if the owner gets to decide who does any kind of research on it, then that's no longer repeatable. So that is generally why fossils in private collections, it's kind of frowned upon to do science on them. So, after some of these controversies, the person actually did end up withdrawing it from science, and I don't believe it's available for study currently. But when it was published in 2015, it was sort of touted as the missing link for lizards to snakes. However, somebody else did get a chance to study it, and when they published on it in 2021, they determined that it was not actually a snake, but a close but not terribly close relative. So not on the way to snakes, but sort of a cousin of snakes.
Oh.
So less fancy than this person might have wanted, but I believe it was after this study that the person was like, I don't want you people looking at my thing anymore. So, all that to say, we don't really know how or why lizards lost their legs to become snakes. But there are some cool highlights after that happens. By the time the Cretaceous ends, at 66 million years ago, snakes were more or less similar to today's boas and pythons. Generally more heavy-bodied, not necessarily as big, but sort of bigger, stockier. And after the end Cretaceous mass extinction, there were lots of niches open, particularly for some large predators.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Paleocene, so in the 10 million years or so, right after the extinction, in South America, we get a genus called Titanoboa.
Titanoboa.
Which is an excellent name. If you've ever seen the movie Anaconda, they should have called the movie Titanoboa, because that was effectively what the movie was about.
Yeah.
Okay.
This would have been an animal that looked very much like an anaconda, all the same body proportions, so a big, chunky snake, except it could get up to about 45 feet long. Which, for reference, like I said, the largest snakes today only get like maximum 25.
That's crazy.
It's a gigantic snake. And it was mostly eating fish, probably. Not even doing what anacondas do today and eating things like deer and you know, the crocodilians that live down there. Nope, mostly fish.
Wow.
A little bit later, we see a somewhat smaller snake in northern Africa called Gigantophis, which was a giant sea snake around 30 to 35 feet long. So lots and lots of big snakes. We live in a world of relatively small snakes today.
That's probably for the best.
Yeah, I mean, well, to be fair, we probably would have killed all the big ones by now.
Nice.
Humans are pretty good at that. But
That is kind of a thing.
yeah, the big thing in snakes was in the last 20 million years or so, as global climates tended to cool and dry, grasslands really exploded across the entire world, but especially here in North America. And small rodents really like grasslands. It gives them lots of spaces to hide. It gives them tall grass to hide in. It gives them lots of food because things like wheat and barley and most of the regular human crops that aren't fruit are really good eating for small rodents, and small rodents are really good eating for snakes. So around this time, as these grasslands spread and diversified, so did snakes. That's where we get vipers and elapids, the two main groups of venomous snakes, spreading more and more across the world, including to North America. That was the first time that they got here. A little bit after that, we get the first rattlesnakes, which are exclusively a North and South America thing. And especially the sort of quote-unquote average snake group, the Collubroids, they absolutely explode in diversity around this time to give us all the different groups that we have today.
Wow.
Yeah. So the world of snakes that we live in has only really been there for, give or take, 15 million years ago.
Which is shorter than I would have thought. I would have thought that snakes went back just like forever.
Right. And they do, but they weren't as big a part of their ecosystems as they are today.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the story of snakes, and I wish that their fossil story was a little more complete. But it really does seem like most of the most interesting snakes live today, which is fairly unusual for a paleontologist to say.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have snakes with all sorts of different features, like the gliding snake. Obviously, that snake had to evolve from something, but we don't have any evidence of any snakes in the fossil record having the ability to glide like that. Things like spitting cobras. They are extremely specialized because not only do they have the little hole at the bottom of their fangs to like inject their prey like a needle, they also have another forward-facing hole in their fangs to squirt the venom out of that way too, so they can spit at you. Super cool. No record of that in the fossil record.
Wow.
So lots of really, really cool snakes around today. So next time you see a snake, maybe just leave it alone. Whether you see it in your yard or just sort of out and about, just leave it alone. Let it do its thing. It will always lose a fight with you, so it does not want to fight you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's actually a fun anecdote that I learned when I was living in South Dakota, is that the rattlesnakes in sort of the Great Plains are evolving away the ability to rattle, because we kill the ones that rattle, so the ones that stay quiet live.
Oh, wow.
So the reason that they have the rattle is to warn you, hey, I'm spicy, don't come near me. And we kill the ones that tell us they're spicy, so now we only have the hidden spicy ones, which you don't
more
want.
Terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah. So you don't have to love snakes, but don't be afraid of snakes. Just let them do their thing from a respectable distance, and everyone will be more happy. That's my moral of the story.
Including the snakes.
Especially including the snakes. The snakes will be ecstatic, because there are very few snakes that can win a fight with a human.
True.
At least without dying themselves. Like, there are lots of snakes that can win a long-term fight with a human, or at least come to a draw, because it'll kill you too after you kill it. But, like, a human can very readily, even probably with just like your bare hands, kill a king cobra fairly easily. But at best it will be a draw. So the snake doesn't want to bite you, and also you are not what its venom is for. It's for its food. So it doesn't want to spend it on you. It wants to spend it on something it's going to get resources out of, which is not you. So for like the fourth time that I'm saying it here, just leave them alone. They don't like you either.
Please leave snakes alone, and we will be leaving you alone until next week on I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive.
That was excellent.
Yes.
I know, that was one hell of a job on my part. So, next week we have a Mike Takes the Wheel episode. I don't know what we're going to do, but I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are too. But until then, take care, everybody.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.